Okay, well, today we're looking at the presidency of William McKinley moving into the Roosevelt years. Look at McKinley and foreign policy, look at the Spanish-American War, the Philippine War, Progressive Era, Theodore Roosevelt, Jane Addams, Square Deal, Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug Act, the Open Door Policy, and the Panama Canal. Questions? Okay. Well, William McKinley was from Ohio. He was the last veteran of the Civil War to become president. He was a major in the Civil War. After the war, probably that, becoming a member of Congress, eventually governor of Ohio, then president. Conservative president. He believed in the strict gold standard, was not interested in farm reforms, populist movement, or anything of that sort. Basically keeping business steady. 1900, he signed into law the Gold Standard Act, which ended the debate over free silver once and for all. The major reform the populists have been pushing for to try to increase commodity prices for farmers. But America at the turn of the century was an industrial power. So we were the largest producer of goods in both terms of amount and value in the world. So the United States was large. It was not a colonial power much at this point, but it was moving in that direction. It's mostly neutral in world affairs, but the United States is willing to assert itself, especially when issues involving the Western Hemisphere. And America was steadily expanding outward. Foreign trade is increasingly becoming an issue. 1870, U.S. exports totaled $392 million. That's about $7 or $8 billion in today's money, but actually not much in comparison to today's economy, but start. By 1900, total U.S. exports are up to $1.4 billion. About $10 billion or so today's money, $10 to $12 billion. But what you can see, though, is in the 30 years, the importance of foreign trade is increasing rapidly in the United States, increasingly becoming a significant portion of the American economy. Not just what we sell and distribute within the United States, but what we sell and distribute around the world. Now we say at the same time here, the late 1800s, is that great nations of Europe are fighting for new colonies to expand their trade, to find new resources, very aggressive colonization. Africa is being carved up. This time Europe is setting its sights on carving up the dying Chinese Empire ruled by the Manchu dynasty. And more, the United States became a very powerful, very advanced nation. There's a general feeling in the United States that you should step up and be part of this too. Around the world, colonies are being seen increasingly as a status symbol. You hadn't really arrived as a nation unless you had colonies overseas. It is a symbol of your power and prestige around the world. And even there's this idea, this new manifest destiny, that was God's will for the United States to become a colonial power, expanding into the Pacific and into Asia. Now, social Darwinism, which had played a role in American domestic policy, particularly in the idea that charity was a bad thing. Well, social Darwinism also reared its head among foreign policy as well. The idea that both nations and races alike struggled for existence constantly, and time would weed out the weak. It is the strong nations are strong because they overpower the weak. And for them to stay strong and powerful, to survive as powerful nations, they have to continually undermine the weaker nations of the world. But see, social Darwinism and imperialism was at odds with America's traditionally democratic outlook. A little over 100 years before this, what's America? A colony. America still remembered this. America celebrated the centennial in 1876. Remembered we were a colony. A lot of people believe that the United States, having been a colony, we knew how wrong it was to have somebody else calling the shots for us not to be able to determine the fate of our own communities. Democratic principles, majority rule, that is, the people should be able to decide the fate of their own communities for themselves. But imperialism was directly contradicting that. It meant some larger power abroad should call the shots for somebody else, whether they liked it or not. This time we have an interesting book coming out. A naval officer named Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power on History. One of these books that kind of gets people thinking. Written in 1890. Well, Mahan had gone through military history since the beginning of time and noted that the great powers of history were always great naval powers. They always have large, powerful navies. Ancient Egypt had a large, powerful navy that allowed it to control the Nile River in the eastern Mediterranean. The Romans had a powerful navy that allowed it to control the entire Mediterranean Sea region. The British were a powerful empire because they had a strong navy that could send them all over the world. The Vikings had been powerful at one time because they had a powerful navy able to send them all over Europe. And so Mahan continues that the United States, because it's bounded up by two oceans, the Atlantic on one side, the Pacific on the other, it had to have a strong navy just to defend itself. Therefore, the United States is destined to become a great power. Now, Mahan, with this idea in mind, he pushed for rapid advances and modernization of the U.S. Navy and the buildup of the U.S. Navy. It's left him at odds with some people, but nevertheless, by 1898, the United States had the fifth largest navy in the world. By 1898, it had the third largest, behind only Great Britain and Germany. But in 1900, the United States was not the overwhelming military superpower it is today. So today, any foreign policy question is always punctuated with the question, what's America going to do? So nations of the world look to the United States, what are we going to do about a particular situation? Are we going to step in? Are we going to advocate some policy? But then at 1900, though, the U.S. is just one voice in a choir. One of about 7 major powers dominating the world at that point, including Germany, Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, among others. But the United States, though, its power is slowly increasing. Its naval power is increasing. Like I said, Mahan's book had a lot of influence on members of Congress. but also had an influence on Theodore Roosevelt, who had always been fascinated by the Navy. As a senior at Harvard, he wrote a book called The Naval War of 1812. It's basically a book describing all the different naval battles of the war. And the United States began exerting its influence in the New World by attempting to form a stronger union among the nations of the Americas. It's what they call the Pan-American Congress. I mean, basically all Americans. And so you go to different parts of Latin America, they'll say, yeah, they're Americans too. Central Americans, South Americans, like that. The United States referred to as North Americans. But the Pan-American Congress, though, all it really managed to do is create maybe a few trading alliances, maybe just itself a little more than a glorified debating society. But it showed that the United States is becoming more interested in the affairs of Latin America. So in 1895, Venezuela is in the middle dispute with Great Britain over the border with its neighbor, colony of British Guyana. This border dispute. Britain is trying to expand its border and its influence, basically trying to chip away at Venezuela. And the issue is about to go to war, and President Cleveland steps in and tells Britain that the United States is invoking the Monroe Doctrine, which I have been talked about or mentioned in decades. Basically, the idea that the United States considered the Western Hemisphere to be off limits for European colonization. And Cleveland further told Britain that you're going to respect the border of Venezuela and you're going to back off, or you're going to face war with the United States. Britain got on this hoping they could get some land very quickly from Venezuela or overpower Venezuela in a quick war, realized they did not want to war with the United States and agreed to mediation of their dispute. They backed down very quickly. But also, yes, it's expanding its reach further. Here to page 697. Start seeing American interest in the Pacific on this map. The United States acquired a number of small islands here along the equator in the late 1850s, Halland, Baker, and Kingman Reef. Basically had little strategic importance, just a few minor resources and such. But the issue came on here with Hawaii. Now, Hawaii had long been an important island group in the Pacific Ocean. Basically, because of its position, it's a midway point between North America and Asia. So it's got a lot of good natural resources, food, fresh water, good natural harbors. It's a good stopping off point. Now, in the 1880s, American naval officers were looking at Pearl Harbor as a potential site for a naval base. Okay, good harbor, good area. It's still only considering it by the 1880s. By 1887, they gained the right to use the area as a base in a naval treaty and start constructing the base from there. But see, at this point, in the 1880s, Hawaii is an independent kingdom, ruled by the native Hawaiians. But as more people started learning about Hawaii coming out there, you have increasingly large American presence. A lot of sugar plantations start being built and developed in Hawaii. It's becoming increasingly important part of the Hawaiian economy. Then 1891, you have strong nationalist queen named Queen Liliuokalani. Here, page 689. It's a native Hawaiian name. She becomes queen in 1891. She's a strong nationalist, believed in making Hawaii a stronger nation, more determined to make Hawaii stand on its own feet and eliminate the foreign presence. Yeah, 689. Well, she's trying to combat the growing American presence. But the sugar planters are pushing back. And see, in 1875, the U.S. government passed a law exempting sugar imported from Hawaii from tariffs coming to the United States. Remember, Hawaii isn't part of the United States. It's still a foreign nation, so Hawaiian sugar, being a foreign product, had a tariff put on it. Except sugar produced in the United States, particularly southern Louisiana, did not. But there wasn't enough being produced within the United States to meet American demand. So this is buying abroad, particularly from Cuba and Hawaii. 1875, the U.S. Congress says Hawaiian sugar will come in tax-free. But 1890, Congress switches it around, bringing in Cuban sugar tax-free. All of a sudden placing a tax on Hawaiian sugar. Well, this meant everyone started buying Cuban sugar instead of Hawaiian, crushed the sugar planters, and they're trying to figure out a way what to do about their economic problems. Liliuokalani didn't like the Americans being there. Her presence was not going to help them with the sugar situation at all. So the best thing to do is make Hawaii a part of the United States. That way, the U.S. gets further protection, gets further benefits being part of the United States, and Hawaiian sugar will again be tax-free. So the planters get what they want. So in 1893, they staged a revolution. Rebels quickly rose up. They requested U.S. assistance, and the American ambassador to Hawaii ordered that a warship be sent in to protect them. Basically, they got the Navy jumping in and helping out the rebels. As a result, in a few days, the Queen surrendered. And the Americans, although they're only 5% of the island population, formed a provisional government and asked for an annexation treaty with the United States. Now, there wasn't a poll on this for the rest of Hawaii. It's just basically the Americans saying, we're the government, we want to be part of the United States. Well, the president at the time, Benjamin Harrison, signed the annexation agreement in February 1893, but the Democratic Senate refused to endorse it because this didn't have the support of all the people at this point. They weren't going to sign this treaty until that support of all the people. So because of this, when Cleveland comes back into office in 1897, he refuses to support it. Do in 1893. So this whole 4 years, Hawaii is basically acting as an independent country. They want to be annexed to the United States, but it's just not happening. But when McKinley comes into office, or comes into office for the first time in 1897, the Republicans are back in control of Congress, and so 1898, the Republican-controlled Senate approves the annexation treaty, making Hawaii part of the United States. There was no real name of the treaty, just the annexation treaty. But here's the thing, Hawaii doesn't become a state until 1959. Had the population, had the resources, just they would not make Hawaii a state. Why? Because the bulk of the island population was Asian and Polynesian. But the U.S. now has Hawaii. Go back here to 697. As American interest in Asia grew, so did interest in the Samoan Islands, about 3,000 miles south-southwest of Hawaii. In 1878, the U.S. won the right to open a naval station in Samoa, gaining that right from native governments. But Germany and Great Britain are also interested in naval bases in the South Pacific. And the Samoan government also gave them a couple of bases as well. So for the next few years, the U.S., Britain, and Germany are kind of jockeying for a position, trying to force out one or both of the other powers. But they never quite come to an agreement. So in 1899, Germany and the United States come to a deal. They divide the islands between them and compensate Britain with another island in the Pacific. So American Samoa becomes a territory in 1899. Still as a territory to this day, they still send a non-voting delegate to Congress.
Who did Germany or Great Britain get?
There's a couple of small islands in and around the area. Nothing big, nothing major. Like I said, the German islands ended up gaining their independence, but the American Samoa was still an American territory. Well, now we turn to Cuba. Go to page 705. Expanding interest in the Caribbean region. Now, the U.S. had always had its eyes on Cuba, and several attempts were made to purchase it or try to gain it one way or another. In the 1850s, U.S. President Franklin Pierce almost went to war with Spain to gain possession of it, but public outcry against the idea forced him to back down. You see, Cuba had been part of a Spanish Empire since 1492, since the expeditions of Columbus. But the way Spain ruled Cuba, though, they brutalized the population and squeezed every last dime out of it. Cubans miserable, oppressed, and deeply impoverished. Cubans had sent up several resistance movements, particularly in 1868. And since the 1868 uprising, there was increasing resistance to Spanish rule. A new uprising, much more powerful, much more violent, was launched in 1895. And a lot of this again comes back to the sugar tariff problem. Now, in 1890, like I said earlier, the tariff exemption on sugar was shifted from Hawaii to Cuba. But 1894, Congress changes its mind. Something called the Wilson-Gorman tariff. Slapped a 40% tariff on Cuban sugar. So this had the effect of crippling the Cuban economy. So with these economic problems in place, it's only fueling the impetus for the 1895 uprising. Fierce struggle up in Cuba that horrified the Americans. Remember, Cuba's just 90 miles from Florida. The U.S. was very interested in what was going on there. Spanish sent in a new general, Valeriano Weyler, to put down the uprising. Weyler uses every means possible to crush the rebellion. Public executions, open battles with the rebels, and also instituted a new policy called the Reconcentrado. Basically, concentration camps. He rounded up the Cuban civilians and forced them into these camps, overpopulated with little food or water, no sanitation, severe disease, lots of disease outbreaks. Basically, he imprisoned the civilians without charge so he could better control them. Thousands of people died of disease, malnutrition in these camps. As a result, an army of 30,000 Cubans was formed, and in the United States, a Cuba Libre Society was formed, basically to raise money and support for the Cuban rebellion. Cuba Libre means Free Cuba. Spain, meanwhile, sending an army of 50,000 men under General Weyler to crush the rebellion once and for all. But while this is going on, the American press is having a field day with this, called the Yellow Press or Yellow Journalism. Happening in American journalism at this point is they're starting to move away from the openly partisan newspapers to more independent and more professional voices in journalism. But their business, so they're trying to sell newspapers. That is, they will put up the most sensational headlines possible. Because they really start getting the idea if it bleeds, it leads. That's basically how they would decide how something goes on the front page. And the atrocities against the Cuban population, New York newspapers especially played it up as much as they could, printing every salacious, filthy detail they could. And so basically this whole issue in Cuba came part of this huge newspaper war in New York. Particularly between William Randolph Hearst and developing this huge chain of newspapers across the United States. He had a paper called the New York Journal. And Joseph Pulitzer, who ran a paper called the New York World. There are about 10 major newspapers in New York at this time period. Only about 3 today. And for all their newspaper war, Journal of the World has been out of business for decades. Pulitzer, you may know, he founded the Pulitzer Prize. That's the most prestigious award in journalism. It's given out to reporters and newspapers who have done the most to promote publication of news in the public interest, truth, of important stories that affect the world, affect communities. Basically, it's an award for every kind of journalism except what was being practiced by Pulitzer and ran the New York World. Now, if McKinley's president in 1897 strived to take a stronger stance on Cuba, the insurrection was gradually losing ground. Well, by 1898, 2 incidents started changing the American perspective on the situation. February 1898, the New York Journal reported the Spanish ambassador to the United States had insulted the American president, calling President McKinley weak and egotistical. His letter to the Spanish government was published in the New York World, in New York. Actually, and that really upset a lot of Americans because, people, regardless of what people thought about McKinley, he was our president, and who's the Spanish government to criticize the United States of America? Second incident, February 1898. Battleship the USS Maine is sent to Havana Harbor. McKinley says on a goodwill tour, basically to show the situation between Cuba, to between Spain and the United States over Cuba is calming down. That's upsetting someone like Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, who were really wanting a war between the United States and Spain. Main brand new top of the line steel battleship. Now the night of February 15th, 1898, flip back 692, this happens. The ship exploded in Havana Harbor. 260 American sailors died. Now the ship was there mostly on a goodwill tour, but also to protect American lives in Cuba. Immediately, he suspected one thing. American ship explodes in Spanish waters. Spain had to have blown it up. Spain had to be responsible. It actually happened this week, February 1898, February 15th. February 15th, 1898. Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. So immediately everyone's thinking, Spain did it. Spain blew up the Maine. So all the country, within days, you have the slogan, remember the Maine to hell Spain. People are calling for war. Well, McKinley tried to avoid war. March asked Spain to agree on an armistice to end the concentration camps, to end this reconcentrado policy, and negotiate with the rebels for permanent peace. Spain said they'd agree to the first two, on an armistice and in the concentration camps, but reserve the right to resume hostility against the Cuban rebels at any time. Well, the situation was made even worse when a court of the U.S. Court of Naval Inquiry issued its report on the explosion of the Maine. They concluded the Maine exploded as a result of the detonation of a submarine mine. That somebody planted a bomb below the waterline, causing it to explode. Spain. But here's the thing. Decades later, the 1950s, the United States looked at the damage done by the Maine again and realized Spain didn't do this. The Maine was sunk when a boiler in the engine room exploded. It was an accident. What happened to the Maine is what it did to itself. Why it happened, what happened, it's a good crew, but accidents happen. But in 1898, they're saying Spain blew it up. Spain, of course, denied everything. But the results of all this going on, April 25th, 1898, the United States declares war on Spain. The Spanish-American War. Well, the regular U.S. Army, though, was only 28,000 men. McKinley realizes we're going to need a bigger army for this. So they calls for 125,000 volunteers. And America, anxious to get into the fight, instead of 125,000, to get 1 million volunteers. Ohio itself sent up 100,000 men. William Jennings Bryan, his opponent from 1896, even though a pacifist, believing that war is immoral, he led a regiment from Nebraska. Theodore Roosevelt was especially anxious to get involved. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at this point. And so, wanting a field commission, he resigns, joins the Army, gets commissioned as a lieutenant colonel, and goes to San Antonio to organize his own units, which came to be called the Rough Riders. It's a very interesting conglomeration of people in San Antonio. Cowboys, drifters, students from the nearby University of Texas. And so Roosevelt takes his Rough Riders and they head to Florida. Already have this huge group of people assembling. That's the interesting thing about some of these volunteers about the Spanish-American War. You actually had Confederate veterans showing up in their old Confederate uniforms ready to volunteer. But they need to actually get these troops organized and from Florida to Cuba. Meanwhile, although the war is going on, but the United States is trying to transfer a fleet from the Pacific Ocean to Cuba. It meant they had to go all the way around South America, and that's a slow expedition. They were wondering if they could, if the Pacific Fleet could make it there in time. The U.S. had another flotilla out further in the Western Pacific under the command of Commodore George Dewey. May 1st, 1898, Dewey happens to be in the area of the Philippines, which was a Spanish colony, very lightly defended by the Spanish. Dewey takes them out in just a little over a day. Telegraphs back to President McKinley that the United States had taken the Philippine Islands. McKinley had to look on a globe to see where the Philippines actually were. A couple weeks later, Guam falls to American forces without a fight. So by summer, the fight concentrates strictly onto Cuba itself. Now, of course, they're shipping these troops over a little at a time, but Roosevelt was a Rough Rider, was so anxious to get involved in it, so upset about all the delays that they end up stealing a ship, the Yucatan, and sailing it to Cuba themselves. Well, the fighting goes back and forth for a few weeks in Cuba. Roosevelt becomes most famous for his charge here at Kettle Hill. U.S. forces are pinned down. And say Roosevelt gets up out of his trench and leads his men basically a full frontal assault against Spanish forces, defeats them, then sees that American forces are having trouble with nearby San Juan Hill, turns around and leads American forces up San Juan Hill, overpowering Spanish forces there. It's a very impressive feat of military tactics and bravery. Roosevelt, of course, believed he deserved the Congressional Medal of Honor for that, but his request for the medal was turned down, which Roosevelt believed was for political reasons. Interesting story about that. 100 years later, the U.S. Army is looking at this application for Roosevelt's Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery at Kettle Hill and the San Juan Hill. Medal, of course, is for bravery, courage, above and beyond the call of duty. Well, the U.S. Army report takes all the names off everything, just looking at the after-action report and realize that Roosevelt really did deserve the Congressional Medal of Honor and is awarded to him posthumously. Even though he'd been dead for decades by this point, he did get the Congressional Medal of Honor, in fact, the only president ever to receive that medal. Well, the fighting continues most of the summer, but then in the summer, Spain realizes it's lost and has no choice but to surrender. The Spanish-American War is over in 4 months. The U.S. wins the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans were declared American citizens in 1917 and still U.S. Commonwealth. There's actually a movement for statehood out there. And the U.S., which once had eschewed colonies, now has colonies, is now firmly world power, basically stripping Spain of some of its last few remaining colonies. Secretary of State John Hay called the war, quote, "a splendid little war." Over in only 4 months, the U.S. gained all this territory: Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. There were only 379 battlefield deaths, but 5,000 more deaths from disease. Some from tropical diseases and sanitation issues, but one problem was that the Armor Meat Company, though, had apparently sold the Army about 500,000 pounds of rancid meat that had been rejected in England 2 months earlier as being thoroughly unfit for human consumption. And a lot of soldiers would eat this rotten meat. A lot of them got sick. McKinley appointed a special commission to look at the charges, but somehow, very quietly and mysteriously, the whole affair was dropped. Well, the U.S. has Guam, it has Puerto Rico. Cuba is given its independence, but it's made what they call a protectorate. That is, it's independent, but it has to do with whatever the United States says. Now, the Filipinos are not like the Spanish. They're glad to get rid of them, but they're horrified to learn that the United States was declaring that the Philippines now belong to them. They're very unhappy with the U.S. takeover. And even the United States, there's fierce opposition to acquisition of the Philippines. Now, the treaty, in this case, this actually is the Treaty of Paris of 1898. You have another Treaty of Paris. This treaty with Spain turns over control of the Philippines over the United States for $20 million. But nobody ever asked the people of the Philippines how they felt about it. They want to be independent of everybody. But the major powers are ignoring them. You have in the United States the Anti-Imperialist League forming to oppose the takeover of the Philippines in this new imperialist direction of American foreign policy. Anti-Imperialist League included such figures as industrialist Andrew Carnegie, writer and social critic Mark Twain, labor leader Samuel Gompers, and even former presidents Cleveland and Harrison, both saying this takeover of the Philippines was a mistake. Well, William Jennings Bryan convinced several anti-imperial senators to approve the treaty so he could make it an issue in the 1900 elections against McKinley. So the treaty is approved formally on February 6, 1899. But the people of the Philippines, though, thought they wanted America out. So this mass insurrection was staged against the United States and called the Philippine War. The Filipinos determined that they would be free of the United States as well. So 4 years, this long war dragged out. 200,000 American troops are fighting at one time or another to put down this insurrection. 4,300 Americans died. 50,000 Filipinos died. At one point during the war, the Senate was conducting hearings on the war in the Philippines. By that point, about 20,000 Filipinos had died. And they're asking this one official from the McKinley administration why they were fighting in the Philippines. The response was that America was trying to civilize the Filipinos. which one senator replied, "We've civilized about 20,000 of them by now." But the war continued. The U.S. ended up being drawn to the same patterns of brutality as Filipinos employed the same tactics the Cubans had against Spain. The general in charge of this was Arthur MacArthur. Actual name, actual general. Father of the future U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, the World War II hero. In general, a very controversial figure. Anyways, Arthur MacArthur had headed the U.S. Army in the Philippines and knew the people didn't want the U.S. there, but steadily strengthened his resolve to make sure the U.S. overpowered the Filipino resistance. The capture of a key Filipino resistance leader in 1901, insurrection gradually wore out. But the issue of Philippine independence still continued, and when Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in the 1930s, he agreed to give the Philippines its independence, but that was delayed by World War II. In 1942, the Japanese had taken over the Philippines, delaying America's ability to give it its independence. But the Philippines had gained their independence after World War II on July 4th, 1946. So they have the same Independence Day we do. So the U.S. expanding outward. They captured the Philippines. They had a stronghold of several islands in the Pacific. Guam, Hawaii, American Samoa. Guam still an American territory, still sending a non-voting delegate to Congress. In the Mediterranean, actually the Caribbean, Puerto Rico becoming an American territory. The U.S. bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917. Of course, you had the Alaska Purchase in 1867. So the U.S. has grown considerably in territory, power, and influence. But a lot of Americans are very troubled by this direction, especially the idea of going to war to gain territory. But in spite of these questions, 1900, America felt really good about itself. Tremendously optimistic about the new century had in store for them. Their technology is opening up untold possibilities. The advances in medical technology are bringing promise of curing many diseases. Prosperity on the farms and in the factories. Electricity, automobiles, the promise of, new technology and new medical advances. Things are going fairly well for the United States in 1990. So you have all that playing in the election of 1900. It's essentially a replay of the 1896 election with a couple of important exceptions. The Populist Party had faded away, basically absorbed by the Democrats. And they give, and the Democrats again are nominating William Jennings Bryan. And the Republicans nominate William McKinley. But McKinley's running mate, Vice President Garrett Hobart, had died of a heart attack in 1899. So the vice presidency is vacant. So the choice for Republican leaders, they decided to go with Theodore Roosevelt. You see, after his heroism at battles of Kettle and San Juan Hill, 1898 being an election year in New York, Roosevelt's home state, he and his Rough Riders, after the war, immediately went to New York, where Roosevelt campaigned for governor and won overwhelmingly. Roosevelt, very outspoken, a reformer, a very popular figure. A lot of people think there's no limit to what Roosevelt's ultimate career trajectory will take. Maybe even the White House. But there are a lot of forces in the Republican Party who were opposed to Roosevelt because he was an outspoken reformer. Didn't like how Roosevelt liked to rock the boat. So, party bosses made Roosevelt vice president. Now, the vice presidency basically was just, at this point, it's a dead-end job. Very little to do, very little influence. Like say in the vice presidents, like say really didn't become president. The last vice president who became elected president directly after the end of a presidential term in office was 1836. Parties are not in the habit of nominating vice presidents for president. And there's this one vice president once described the vice presidency of Thomas Marshall as Woodrow Wilson's vice president said, "There were once two brothers. One went to sea, the other became vice president. Neither was heard from ever again." Well, farm issues weren't quite as important in 1900, but Bryan still had a lot of support from rural areas in the 1900 election. And Bryan attacked the imperialistic turn the U.S. was taking. He was a pacifist. He loathed war, even though, especially wars of conquest. He had participated in the war, but his unit never saw any action, a conflict. He also attacked trusts with a renewed vigor. But McKinley stressed his record at home and abroad. The U.S. is doing very well economically. The U.S. foreign policy is working very well for the United States. It's winning fairly easily. So McKinley wins with 51.7% of the vote, 292 electoral votes. Bryan gets 45.5% of the vote, 155 electoral votes. And the Prohibition candidate, John C. Woolley, rounds out the rest. 1.5%. So McKinley re-elected. And for the first time since 1872, since U.S. Grant, a president was re-elected to consecutive terms. Unfortunately for McKinley, though, he didn't get to see the fruits of a second term. September 6, 1901, 6 months into his second term, he was in the receiving line of the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Basically, it was kind of a World's Fair. A lot of NATO devices on display, a lot of products. And McKinley's in the receiving line. Except, kind of shows the difference between McKinley and Bryan. Bryan was a politician who relied on oratory, basically a very old-fashioned kind of politician, but McKinley liked the quiet style, glad-handing, shaking hands, and so forth. And he's in the receiving line, shaking hands, everybody comes by, big smile and everything going very well. And all of a sudden, disaster struck. An unemployed laborer and anarchist named Leon Czolgosz moved through the line, stepped forward, and shot McKinley. McKinley fell back, severely wounded. But surgeons tried probing through McKinley's abdomen trying to find the bullet. Couldn't find it. Probing for it, doing all these exploratory procedures, digging, probing. Interesting enough, there's a brand new invention on display at the Pan American Exposition that might have been able to help him find it, but surgeons didn't use it. That device, the X-ray machine. People really didn't know about it, really didn't think about it in terms of using it as a medical diagnostic tool yet. They actually called on Thomas Edison to develop a metal detector to see if they could find the bullet to use. Edison tried to work something up, but could never quite make it work. It was either not sensitive enough or so sensitive it's detecting springs in the mattress under McKinley. Never quite get it right. Interestingly enough, Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of Abraham Lincoln, was at the Pan American Exposition. Lincoln is the only man in American history to have been present at 3 presidential assassinations. He was at his father's deathbed in 1865. He was on the train platform with Garfield. He was shot in 1881. And he's at the Pan American Exposition in 1901. McKinley was shot. And the guy was bad luck to have around. Actually, he was a cabinet secretary at one point, very respected figure, but the guy was bad luck. As for McKinley, after 8 agonizing days on December 14th, McKinley died. And now Theodore Roosevelt's president. The America that Theodore Roosevelt has inherited as president is radically different from the one that William McKinley had inherited. One now firmly a world power, expanding industrial power. But Roosevelt's reputation didn't inspire a lot of immediate confidence in some. Republican Party boss Mark Hanna's comment on Roosevelt's ascension to the presidency, quote, "Now look, that damn cowboy's president." Well, what we start seeing here at the beginning of 20th century, though, and they have men like McKinley who are generally opposed to reforms, don't kind of like things the way they are. There's this increasing push in the United States, particularly from the media, to try to push for some kind of reforms, trying to root out corruption. Except a lot of it kind of stemming from the tradition of this yellow press. You have a lot of new magazines coming available, very cheap to print and coming into American homes. That's these magazines reaching up to 250,000 homes every month. You've got Life magazine, McClure's, Ladies' Home Journal, Cosmopolitan. Those are all very big magazines, 1900. Readers are attracted by interesting fiction serialized in the magazines, flashy illustrations. We have magazines that are about 5-10 cents an issue. But a lot of these newspaper editors, journalism editors like Samuel McClure, they're interested in stories about corruption in America. And McClure published a lot of what's called exposés, exposing stock market price fixing, corruption in city and state governments, payoffs between politicians, and so forth. Becoming something so common that by 1906, Theodore Roosevelt coined a term for this new generation of journalists: muckrakers. From always raking up muck. But they're doing so by exposing all these problems. There's always this editorial sense that it doesn't have to be like this. It's happening in one city. It's happening in a lot of cities. And it doesn't have to be like this. These are problems that we created ourselves and problems that we can solve ourselves. And these muckrakers pushing for a new wave of reform in the United States, which is now becoming progressive era. A wave of reforms at the city, state, and national level. Roosevelt isn't pushing for this very much at first, but eventually he will push for progressive reforms at the national level. But basically it's starting from this new wave of journalists, the muckrakers. So, and we'll then stop at that point. Okay, for next time, read chapter 24 in your book. And if there's nothing more, we'll see you all next time.